Welcome to Feminist Question Time. It's brought to you by Women's Human Rights Campaign, which is the leading global organisation defending women's sex-based rights against the threats posed by gender identity ideology. There is more information on the website womensdeclaration.com, where you'll find our declaration on women's sex-based rights, which has been signed by 27,857 people from 155 countries and is supported by 405 organisations. As well as signatories, we have activists in 54 countries. If you'd like to get involved in the work of WHRC, there's a form on the website. This week on Feminist Question Time, we have Jesika Gonzalez from TERF Collective. She's going to be giving us an overview of the nature, purpose and work of TERF Collective. Beth Stelzer from the United States from Save Women's Sports. She's going to tell us about the recent International Olympic Committee decision, what it means to female athletes and how we can move forward, and possibly some other stuff about sports. And Miriam Kivlehen from Ireland, and she's going to give us an update on what's happening in Ireland. I'm really pleased to hand the voice to Jesika Gonzalez. She is an ordinary working class woman, founder of TERF Collective, an organisation pursuing guerrilla approaches to fighting trans ideology. The TERF Collective hosts semi-weekly chat sessions and is very active mostly in the United States, but also internationally. So thank you so much, Jesika, for coming and for talking to us today. And I'm going to hand over to you.
My name is Jesika Gonzalez. I am, like you said, just an ordinary working class TERF with a Facebook account and now activist organizer. That just happened to have had a really good year. With a bit of tenacity, but really just a lot of luck, I managed to leverage that Facebook account into what has grown into a small but global army of women involved in every aspect of the fight against the global campaign of female erasure. That small global army is TERF Collective. We now have been lucky enough to have members of TERF Collective at everything from the We Spa protest in July to the Adrian Harrop tribunal, which just recently ended. We have women in a lot of places and spaces, and our vision is to have women literally everywhere. I want to very briefly address our name. I'm sure some listeners will take umbrage with and exception to a group of feminists calling ourselves TERFs. We take the name in part to neutralize its use against us, and secondly, frankly, to mark ourselves as the edgy wing of the movement. We can and will do things other groups having relationships and reputations to worry about can't or won't. The accusations of being a TERF is not a substantive argument against our positions, and we therefore take on the name to stipulate that yes, we do exclude men, including those that call themselves trans women, from our places, spaces, organizing, and feminism outright. There is no need to fight. You win the point. Women are being re-traumatized at rape crisis centers and support groups, sexually assaulted by so-called lesbian men in single-sex spaces, and all our hard-earned social and political allocations, even sports and scholarships, are all being hemorrhaged. At a time like this, we refuse to be diverted into a debate about being called TERFs. In fact, if standing for the dignity of these women makes us TERFs, we would be deeply ashamed indeed not to be TERFs. What is TERF Collective? TERF Collective is a group that was born when I had an idea that all we TERFs on Facebook that spend so much time trolling trans identity supremacists and even each other might be served by having weekly meetings. The vision was simply for a time and space where we could come together and talk. Something similar to the breakout rooms here at Feminist Question Time, but the goal was to gather women where they already were, which of course was Facebook. There was no agenda and no goal, just a sisterhood circle to talk about our struggle against trans ideology. The first step was to make a Facebook group. I did that on April 27. That night, and I'm sure the following day, I proceeded to invite as many TERFs as I could from my Facebook friends list, and of course, anyone that had responded to my Facebook posts about the idea for a video chat group. 4 countries on 3 continents were represented at our initial meeting held on April 29th. It was immediately apparent 2 meetings per week would be necessary to create an opportunity for as many women across as many time zones as possible to have a time slot that might work for them. The meetings are quite popular, with women we consider rad femme royalty stopping by on occasion. We sometimes get as many as 40 women on a single call. I can't recall ever hosting a meeting with less than a dozen women. Next, I'd like to talk about our activism. The original vision for TERF Collective was just, of course, a sort of headquarters for Facebook TERFs. However, in early June, I had an idea that would change who we are and what we do. It turns out that back in 2016, Target, a major box store chain here in the United States, changed its bathroom policy to what we essentially might refer to as self-ID. American conservatives had carried out a massive boycott of Target in response to this new policy. While ultimately the boycott was determined to have a bit of an impact on profits for Target, it was not enough to force them to change their policy. In 2018, a man that runs a website, womanmeanssomething.com, collected all the news reports of sexual assaults that had taken place within Target stores since the self-ID bathroom policy was imposed. What he found once he collected all the data was that there was an increase in incidences of voyeurism in changing rooms since Target announced a policy that would allow for people that identify as transgender to use the sex-segregated facilities of their choice. Immediately upon stumbling onto an article about this, I thought that TERF should protest by placing many flyers with information from the study at Target stores. I brought the idea to our next meetings, and there it was determined that the best way to distribute the flyers was not to put them in the bathrooms as I had originally envisioned, but instead to place the flyers into the actual merchandise. From there, we were off and running, listing off all the places in the actual merchandise to be purchased where we could stash the flyer. This way, we were assured that nearly every flyer we placed would be seen by a female customer. I threw together an initial social media post, which included a picture of the flyer and doubles as the file to be printed to participate, and some tips and tricks on how to do it. The flyer simply reads, "Did you know that since the start of their inclusive bathroom policy in 2016, Target has had a 190% increase in peeping Tom incidents? The evidence for this is cited in 2 forms. The reader is invited to scan the QR code to be taken directly to the study, or to simply type into their browser and visit womanmeanssomething.com. All the way to the right in the corner, we take credit for the effort by signing the flyer TERF Collective in very small print. Some women have expressed an interest in participating, but didn't like the fact that our flyer was signed. If a woman won't do the work with our name there, then merely import it into your own picture editing software and white it out. We much rather the work get done. The importance of our name being on there isn't merely a matter of notoriety. It's also important in case any women that are piqued by it, or any women that are already piqued and find it, can find us. It's important that leftist women especially are able to easily discover that there is already a movement out there. Before I peaked and started digging around and stumbled onto Deep Green Resistance, Magdalene Burns, and Kathy Brennan, I wouldn't have imagined that there were liberals or leftists that are anti-trans ideology. In fact, before I peaked, I didn't even know there was such a thing as radical feminism at all. In light of this, we believe it would be a wasted opportunity to have anyone find the flyer, be intrigued by the information, but dismiss it, assuming it must be a right-wing job. In the end, though, we rather the information get out than not get out, and we would sort out right wing and left wing on the back end. The important thing is that we disseminate the information. Anything else comes second. We got a Twitter account to promote the Target action, and also as a way to be found on the internet by anyone that might come across the flyer. Our Twitter provided us a small but powerful powerful platform from which to promote the target action, and so we did. We tweeted photos and we got back from every drop. We highlighted how easy it was to do and showed photos specifically how and where all the flyers could go. This created excitement around the campaign and encouraged others to participate. Every piece of merchandise we could identify as having an adult human female as its likely buyer became a TERF battleground. No jeans back pocket, woman's windbreaker, or box of panty liners was safe. To date, we've placed nearly 10,000 flyers in merchandise and Target stores across the country. We've had members do over 50 stores in Vermont, New York, Virginia, Illinois, Minnesota, Washington, California, and others still. We went on like this for months, promoting the protest and showing off our work on Twitter and Facebook. We couldn't have had all the success, however, without a little help from our enemies. I know of at least, I know that at least a few sisters that come here to Feminist Question Time will be familiar with this tweet, a tweet whose chirp was heard all around the TERF world. This confused man found one of our flyers in his bag when he got his online order home. He immediately tweeted to complain about it, including, luckily for us, a photo of the flyer itself. You can see from the image how far that helped word travel. In September, our joy turned to trepidation when one of our members, Thistle Pedersen, was charged with a felony in her home state of Wisconsin. Thistle is the founder of WLRN, Women's Liberation Radio News. Thistle has been charged with a hate crime. Her alleged offense having been putting up a TERF Collective sticker on a magazine box. We had a meeting to offer Thistle support and have her tell us about the charges. It was a tense meeting. The worry was visible on everyone's face. Naturally, outrage and indignation also filled the space. We knew that the charges were bogus, and just one more example of the targeting, both social and legal, that feminists face for being feminists, but we had no clue what would happen. The system has the power to do whatever it wants, even what it wants is unjust. The next morning, I watched Thistle's hearing as it happened and recorded the tail end of the decision. The district attorney quickly conceded Wisconsin law has no foundation for a charge of a hate crime against TERF speech, as gender identity is not a class covered by the statute. The judge held that the speech was covered under the First Amendment, stating free speech doesn't just apply to good speech, it probably applies more to the bad speech. With that, the case was dismissed and Thistle was freed. No matter what comes, TERF Collective won't wish. Shifting back to our work, I'd like to talk a bit about the campaigns we carry out and why we focus on these kinds of protests. I call our campaigns, whether they be stickering or pamphleting and flyering, paper protests. Soon we will be adding postcards to the list. Paper protests are very useful in that they lean into and take advantage of what we might otherwise consider weaknesses. For example, when carrying out a national or international paper protest, it is a benefit, not a detriment, that women are remote from one another. This helps us carry out the protest in more places. This remoteness also serves to signal how our problems aren't localized and highlights that there are women in cities and towns, large and small, all over the world that feel this same way. The other benefit of the paper protests, and this is extremely important, is accessibility to all classes and lifestyles. There is no time frame in which these are to be done. They can be done very cheaply and with relative privacy. You do these protests right in your area, and you pick where and when you do your drops. The facts, they can be printed at home or at a public library or even at a print shop for pennies per sheet, highlights the fact that we are, in fact, a grassroots movement and are not funded by the right wing, as trans supremacists like to claim. I'd like to now show you our latest project. It is a pamphlet suitable for distribution anywhere in the world, but mentions some cases specifically from the US and the UK. It is a trifold pamphlet with 6 panels jam-packed with peaking information. It addresses sports, shelters, child transition, lesbian and gay rights, trans-identifying male sexual predators, and the differences between trans and intersex. and a whole panel dedicated to the Wiesbaugh flasher we all now know has a history of sexual offenses. Our sisters across the ocean have also been working on flyers of their own. Their flyers are stunning, and I'd like to show you two examples if I could. A little sister, an absolute powerhouse that is a member of TERF Collective and Essex Resistors, brought this to our attention. This flyer was originally the work of Soul Sisters in Scotland as part of their Vote with Your Feet campaign. The Essex Resistors reworked the flyer for distribution in England. In bullet points, it explains the harms of self-ID and directs the readers on what they can do. I would like to see us do one in this style here. Another one that I really need to mention, because this campaign is going on right now, so you can still get involved, is the All I Want for Christmas campaign by the Women's Rights Network. It reads, all I want for Christmas is single-sex spaces, then goes on to list where those are being lost. It also cites sexual assault stats for mixed-sex spaces. This one also tells the reader what they should be doing. It's really nicely done, and I encourage everyone to check out the All I Want for Christmas hashtag. There are many women all over the world that are doing paper protests, but if we really want to grow the movement, we must all do even more. And it's easy enough, it's an easy enough activity that we really all can. Use our materials or make your own, but please put papers and stickers everywhere you go. Since we do not have traditional media, social media, or even fringe media outlets won't touch us, we have to get the word out into our communities ourselves. Find ways to incorporate it into your life in a way that works for you, but we have to do it because no one else will do it for us. The other side has massive money and platforms, and all we have is that we're right. Luckily for us, that's all we'll need. Before I close, I want to take a moment to thank each and every member of TERF Collective for your dedication to the group. No sister was ever under any obligation to join me in my silly little idea. There was never any promise or even prospect of success in or recognition for any of our endeavors, but you came anyway, and you still do. You showing up with your best ideas, most incisive critiques, as well as, of course, your dedication to the tedium of printing, cutting, and folding thousands of pieces of paper have made 2021 the best year of my life. Thank you.
So now we're going to hear from Beth Stelzer. So Beth is the homemaker wife, mom, and an armature and armature powerlifter from Minnesota, founder of Save Women's Sports. She's traveled throughout the USA working to protect women's sports. And in a couple of years, Save Women's Sports has grown from a website to an international coalition that has influenced legislation. And we're really pleased to have you on, Beth, to hear what's happening in the States and internationally in the IOC Olympic Committee decision. So thanks for coming, and over to you.
So just a little bit about me, as Joe said, wife, mom, I'm an average American, right? And I got this kick to go be an amateur powerlifter. And I trained for like 2 years until I felt ready to be in the women's state championships. And there, a male basically ruined the entire event because he wasn't allowed to compete as a woman. So that's my peak trans moment. And that's when Save Women's Sports arose. I have started a free website. It's almost been 3 years now. And taken that, like Jesika, grassroots, just building it up post by post. And now we are testifying for laws. We're an international coalition of men and women, left and right. It's a hands across the aisle moment coming together for this one thing, and that's to protect women. I've testified in state hearings. We had over 40 states in the United States try to enter in bills. 9 of them became laws in the last year. So I've just been really working with my team. And as of last week, I did a live TV with Laura Ingram, which was just like incredibly amazing. And I can't wait for more of us to get in that spotlight. All right, there I am testifying with one of my build sponsors in the background. So this is a picture of Charlotte Cooper, and she's one of the first women champions in the Olympics. We first competed in 1900 in Paris. 22 of the 997 athletes were women that competed in 5 sports. Now, since we jump forward 2012, the games in London were the first games in which women competed in all of the sports. And since 1999, it's been a rule that any new sports have to have women's competitions added. In 2016, so just a couple of Olympics ago, 45% of the participants were women, and we're closing that gap now. In 2021, I'll add, was the first year that BMX bike racing was added to the Olympics for women. And so first year Olympic team for women in the USA, an alternate was a male. He almost qualified for the team. First year of a women's event in the Olympics. So that's why we are fighting. I won't get too deep into sex testing and testosterone because all that stuff really doesn't matter. We already know what defines a woman, right? But in the past, they've done cheek swabs for these athletes. They had to carry a little card with them. That was kind of like a DNA certificate that said what they were. Of course, now that's been dissolved, and we'll get into that in the future. A great reference, a super fantastic woman in this fight, Linda Blade. She has an awesome Twitter thread dated from April 3rd, 2020, that is all of the history of the Women's Olympics. I recommend you head over there. She goes way more in depth than this, so I'm just kind of skimming the top today. So in 2003 is when the Olympics first admitted, hey, there's a difference between men and women. We probably should keep the men out of the Women's Olympics, or at least have some kind of guidelines. At that point in time, they said that males needed full surgery in order to compete as a woman. We go to 2015, and there was an announcement made by a small panel of people, which included one transgender athlete and their FUI, if you can call it proof or evidence. They had self-reported studies from trans people. So basically, this was not scientific, peer-related evidence that the IOC board used in 2015 to create testosterone limits. As we all know, women are not a hormone level. Testosterone limits are not going to magically change you into a woman or dissolve those physical differences. Their limit was 10 nanomoles a liter, which is really important. And that was only for 2 years. And in that 2 years, it's very easily to manipulate, to know when they're going to be tested. Testosterone limits can be easily manipulated. So there's really no way to tell that they were under 10 for those 2 full years. But a female normal range is around 1, 0.3 to 1. Even when a woman has a condition like polycystic ovarian syndrome, where they have a naturally higher testosterone level, that range goes up to about 6 on average. So this level of 10 is 3, 5, 10 times higher than what a normal woman has. It's just absolutely ridiculous that they can come to this conclusion. Now, today, after pressure we put on them, over 40 organizations came together to join a petition with Save Women's Sports a couple of years ago. We thought we were going to get in on this conversation. Nope, not given a seat at the table. Policy comes out, 2021, no limitations. They basically passed it off to underlying organizations to determine fairness in sports. So basically, summing it up, they abandon women. And as far as my team can tell, the medical commission of the International Olympic Committee was not even consulted for this. So we're digging into further, like, why would you not even consult your medical commission on this? Some of the reasons why we need to fight, most people are aware of Laurel Hubbard, who competed in weightlifting, a 40-year-old white male, privileged, who took the spot of 20-year-olds, some indigenous ladies. It's absolutely ridiculous. But also we have issues like Caster Semenya, who has a male disorder of sexual development that includes testosterone producing gonads. So still a thing, this is a male body in women's sports, and testosterone limits are not going to cut it. There's no compromise when it comes to protecting women. Men are even invading the Paralympics. Valentina Petrillo was racing there in track. Absolutely ridiculous. And if we all don't speak up, it is just going to keep evolving and more women are going to lose their spots. We need to all speak up. Everyone needs to do their part, even if it is just on social media, commenting or whatnot. But I encourage you to take that step further, make calls, write letters, stay active on social media. This isn't just for sports, this is for all of our battles, as I call them, branches of the tree. We all really need to step up and get a light shown on this so the media can't ignore us. In 2019, Save Women's Sports joined over 40 organizations, including Women's Human Rights Campaign, to send a petition to the Olympics. And like I said, their response sounded like, hey, we were going to get a seat at the table or be consulted when they were going to change these rules. And no, nothing. So we're working on our next steps further. That's beginning stages of how we're going to reapproach the IOC. We are in the beginning stages of a model policy for these underlying organizations to use so that when they are curious about what the steps should be to protect women, we can point them to it. And a lot of these 40 organizations from that petition are going to come together and endorse this model policy, which I'm really excited about. We are working on protesting these events where males are competing as females. We're in the very early stages of that, but supplies will be available online soon. Females demand fairness, and we won't let them ignore us anymore. My bottom line there, we really do need your help and support, and you cannot assume that women like me have it all under control. I'm an average woman treading water. We all need help. You can't assume that I'm doing enough. If you feel the need to start your own website, start your own website. You know, be anonymous, don't be anonymous. Just do whatever you can. If you want to start a Save Women's Sports branch in your country, feel free to contact me. We're expanding out that way. I'm just going to leave you all with the emperor's not naked. He's not wearing a dress. He's wearing a swimsuit this time around. And it's time for all of us to point it out.
So we're now going to hear from Miriam Kivlahan. She's from Ireland. Miriam's going to give us a background on the Irish context for people who haven't found out or heard about what's going on in Ireland, and then give us a bit of a focus on the current review of the Equality Acts, which the Irish government recently put out to public consultation. So welcome, Miriam, and over to you.
Okay, so I'll talk kind of a little bit about the background, first of all, and just to look at a timeline, I suppose, of the whole gender recognition in Ireland. And Ireland is very often, I suppose, referenced because we seem to have been a forerunner for the self-ID. And so that the timeline for that was that initially it was the result of a High Court order in a landmark case called the Dr. Lydia Foy case, which compelled the Irish state to do something with regard to recognising the legal status of Lydia, who has a sex reassignment operation in the UK at the time and wanted legal recognition as a woman. So that's what sort of prompted it. In 2010, the government set up the Gender Recognition Advisory Group, and it was charged with putting together a report and making the recommendations. And in 2011, that report was published, fairly extensive and very detailed report, and essentially it was recommending a medical pathway. So quite a conservative approach to gender recognition, over 18s only, and through a medical pathway which required some sort of a medical certification from a practitioner. That wasn't well received amongst those who were advocating for a self-ID pathway at the time. So around about 2013, there were two bills for self-ID, which were both tabled in the Parliament by opposition. One was in the lower house and one in the upper house. Now, neither of those got past the first stage, but they were the first indications of a completely different proposal, which looked at no gatekeeping whatsoever, self-determination, So both of those bills were in 2013. In 2014, the Gender Recognition Bill, which was the outworking of the 2011 report, came forward from the Department of Social Protection, was the lead department in government at the time. Now, social protection, for those who might not be aware, is sort of the social welfare department in Ireland. And it came forward with the Gender Recognition Bill 2014. And essentially, again, it was built on the 2011 report, nearly almost an entirely medical pathway. Following the next stage in the timeline, and I'll go back and talk about a couple of these things because they are important in terms of sequencing. 2015 then was very much taken up, I suppose, in Ireland with the marriage equality referendum, and because it was a constitutional bar to being able to legislate for marriage equality, that required a public referendum. So that was a very high profile and very front-facing campaign. And it happens that in 2015, the Gender Recognition Act was amended and eventually brought into law. So those two things happened, and one was very high profile and the other was sort of masked behind that. And I think those who are familiar with the Denton's playbook, as it were, will see that reference in that as to how it's a recommended tactic, in fact, if you can sort of put a campaign behind another more high profile one. 2018, again, we had a public referendum on abortion rights, and that had been a long campaign going back from 2012 that culminated in a referendum in 2018. And legislation for abortion in 2019. So what's the connection between some of those? Well, this was the bill that was introduced in 2014, which eventually became law, and it was initiated in December 2014. And you can see here that an extract from that, the section G on the bottom, requires a certificate in writing of a medical practitioner certifying, and it shows the various requirements that must be forthcoming in order for a certificate to be eligible. That was at the first stage. At the next stage, in January and February 2015, that requirement is still there. So it's gone through a few stages in the Oireachtas, in the Houses of Parliament. It has been deliberated on. Now, if you look at the debates online, you'll see there were actually very little debate and very few even public representatives engaging in the discussion, but nevertheless, it went through a few stages, and you still see that section G is still there. And it wasn't until then they set up, there was a committee to look at some of the lobby groups who were looking for the removal of that. So they set up a select committee, and it was at that point that section G was removed in its entirety. And if you look at that in terms of the timeline, that was quite advanced and well into the whole process. And by July, that whole entire section had been removed from it. Now, anyone who's interested in that whole process can find it at that website domain there. You will actually find the whole timeline of the bill from its initiation to the end and all of the debates. So I suppose what I'm saying is that if you go back to the 2007 test case that set the conditions for this, even members of the public who would have been publicly following this, or who would have had an interest or a side interest, would have been following a particular story. And it was only in that last month that story changed as to what that legislation would look like. And it was during that period of time, as I say, when the marriage equality campaign was in its height, that these other deliberations were coming forward. So what was the response? Well, it really, I suppose, the legislation went relatively unnoticed by most people, as I say, in that background, until around about 2017, when women began to find that it was colliding with some of the stuff that was emerging in the abortion rights campaign and the repeal of the 8th Amendment. It was in full swing. And that was I suppose the first time that women began to realise that there may be an implication, because there was questions about the language that was going to be used in any subsequent legislation. But anybody who's even interested in looking to see how how present the whole discussion was. If you do a confined Google search during that period, June 2014 to June 2015, you'll see the absence of any public debate or commentary on the Gender Recognition Bill or the Gender Recognition Act. So the abortion rights campaign, which is really in its latter time had become a national campaign between 2015 and 2018. That stage, there was an infrastructure around about the country. It was a very, as most of them are in most jurisdictions, they're very hostile campaigns and very weary and very long. And anyway, it did end up in success in Ireland because it was a popular vote that the constitution was changed. Again, there was a constitutional bar, it couldn't be legislated for without that. So you can just, given you from that image there, you can kind of see the two binary positions there. It was yes, no. However, it did pass, which created removed the constitutional bar to being able to legislate for abortion. And it was round about that time that the heads of bill and talking about what the legislation might look like came into public domain. And it was round about that time that then all of a sudden the language began to be contested as to what language would be used in the abortion legislation. And certain advocates were coming forward and wanted to remove references to women or female and replace it with pregnant people. So that, I think, for many women who wouldn't have been following the gender recognition story for numbers of years for any reason, it might have been sort of, I suppose, marginal to their particular mainstream interests, suddenly found themselves very much aware of what was going on. And again, it was mostly on, what happened was, I suppose, a kind of visceral reaction by a lot of women who were kind of very defensive and said, what do you mean there's not going to be women in the abortion legislation? Of course there's going to be women in it. That's what we legislated for. That's what we campaigned for. So to a certain extent, the backlash on social media and in some of those online forums like Mumsnet created a sort of spaces where women ended up, well, some of them, I suppose, there were some women who were vocal about it were put on block lists. So these block lists became like these gulags, became places where women met and realized that there was a whole conversation that needed to be had. And I suppose out of that, a certain amount of the issue began to be, so a certain amount of organizing, for want of a better word, around people who were using the term gender critical and rose. So where are we now, or where we are now, is that in Ireland, there are about 6 different groupings of women that would have spawned out of that background. And I know there's a lot of talk, even in WHRC, about organising. And I suppose from looking back in Ireland over the last couple of years, what I would say is that I think the key thing here is organising and not having a focus on organisation, and it's not getting too hung up on the noun and thinking about the verb, because I think going back in those early stages, there were a very small number of women who were coming together and who were having conversations and wanting to see what could be done. And a lot of energy was put in at the very beginning in trying to hold consensus amongst a small group of people. And it became apparent that women came from very different backgrounds. Some of them had a feminist background, some of them didn't. Some of them didn't care to, and they didn't really want to know about having to sort of do all of that work. They wanted to get into this. So whilst it can seem threatening for a grouping to split and go separate ways, in actual fact, it can be quite advantageous because they cluster and work together. So there are now kind of, I suppose, 6 groupings. One of them is called Radicalini, which borrows its name from the Irish for Colleen, which is a girl, and radical. So that's one of the groups. Now, it doesn't have a very public front-facing figure because a lot of the women actually who are behind that have various reasons to keep their own identity preserved. And there are a couple of migrant women who are involved in that, and they do work with migrants as well, both voluntarily, and they would have concerns about protecting the work they're doing. So they don't don't have a very public front-facing person, but they've been doing a lot of work in the last year and a lot of campaigning and lobbying and organising around submissions to, to public consultations and that sort of thing. Women's Space Ireland is it's a small grouping, and it's focused on, actually what I'll do is, they're just the thumbs, I'll take you through each one. So Rada Collini describe themselves more as from a radical feminist perspective, and that's just as a grab from their website, which kind of shows where their areas of focus are. So they have a broad and a wider lens, and they are interested in rooting themselves in the idea of radical feminism. You can see Twitter handles and websites there as references for anybody who wants to go and find them. The next one is the Countess. I know Leisha has been on here before, so some of you may be familiar with the Countess. And I suppose they came together more around about that conversation and that hook that people would use to call themselves gender critical. So again, not having to confine themselves to any particular school or ideology of feminism and just get stuck in. So that's a grab from their website, which kind of sets out where their focus is really on this particular conversation around about sex and gender and single sex spaces for women. And their references are there. The LGB Alliance started up last year and immediately found itself in all sorts of flurries. There was a very, very hostile and visceral backlash very quickly against the LGB Alliance Ireland. That's Kerry Black there, who is one of the front-facing members of it and has become more and became targeted very quickly. The reaction was very visceral. There was articles written in the newspaper classifying them as hate groups, and a number of organisations actually came together and co-signed a public open letter with regard to proposing to have them legitimised. At the moment, Kerry is in the middle of a storm as well. She's living in the north with her wife and her young children. And again, following on a complaint made by a man on Twitter, she's been investigated by the PSNI on one of these charges of what is it? It's not online harassment, but one of those charges. I can't remember what the technical term for it is. So she's in the middle of that at the moment. It's one of those situations where they invited her in for a caution and she politely declined. So they've now kind of told her to be, ready to be arrested, to come in and answer for those charges. The Irish Women's Lobby then, that's just a quick grab. I actually couldn't grab from their website because it's one of those that you can't take a screenshot. So they said to shape a future in which women and girls can live free from imposed gender roles and expect to be protected from male violence. They have a couple of front-facing members, and Rachel Moran would have been very active prior to this in work around prostitution and campaigning for the Nordic model in Ireland. So some of their members would have maybe a radical feminist background, and some coming in from the more recent contemporary gender critical description. And then Women's Space Ireland is a very small collective of a number of women. They are both, yes, they're both I think they're both named. I'm not sure if both of them are, so I won't mention a name. One of them is a journalist and the other is a writer, and fairly well known. So what they've used their space for really is more, they gather information. They've created a kind of a repository where information can be put. They spend a lot of time doing FOI requests and gathering data and placing it in one single place so that other groups or people who want technical information can find it. And then in the north, there is a group of women who are based in Belfast. They're based in Belfast, but they have members from across the 6 counties. So it's the Women's Rights Network Northern Ireland, and they don't have a website, but there are Facebook pages there, and they are on Twitter. And again, because the jurisdiction there, the legal jurisdiction there is different, they have a different set of challenges or different timelines that they're working off, and it differs as well from in England or even in Scotland and Wales. So recently, leading up, I suppose, to the current work that's been done. So whilst they're all quite different and they all have their own spaces, they do come together collaboratively. And that's a shot just taken a couple of weeks ago outside the Parliament building. So all of the six of them, or sorry, the six groups came together with their front-facing people. So it wasn't a boots on the ground or, you know, feet on the street type of campaign. They simply wanted to come together in a collegial way around with a common message, which was a lead-in, really, I suppose, to encouraging people to engage with the review that was underway on the equality legislation. So that's actually a mix of numbers of reps from the different six groups who came together, those who could be seen in public. And even that itself did provoke a certain amount of backlash on Twitter. And there is a YouTube video, of that event, or of their speeches outside the Parliament, so you can find it at that URL there. So what's happening now at the moment is a review and a proposed review and amendment of the Irish equality legislation. So this has been commissioned by the Department of Children, Disability, Equality, Integration and Youth, which is a very long-winded name for a government department, but it's within that ministry that the responsibility for equality legislation rests for the main part, even though it's quite a broad suite of legislation and crosses over into other departments as well. So they had a review, and closing date was last week. Primarily what they wanted to look was at reviewing the Equal Status Act 2000-2018 and the various Employment Equality Acts. So again, there's a lot of equality legislation that is a part of other legislation, not something that was written as a standalone piece. And to review and one of the things that's stated is they wanted to look at the economic ground for discrimination and the amendment of the gender ground. Now, there's no explanation as to why they wanted to do an amendment of the gender ground. It's simply in there as part of the terms of reference. That's the suite of legislation entirely that's been reviewed in this one single review. So it's quite broad, and obviously there are parts that would impact on other people outside of women, other protected categories of people, but it's just to get an idea of what the list is. The approach I think that a lot of people have taken, I had a quick look at the websites because the closing date was last week, and I see some of them have their submissions up on their websites, and I think they've probably got quite a lot of individual women to make submissions as well. And the thrust of it seems to be that the ask from a lot of the groups is to have sex added as a protected characteristic, because we have one single protected characteristic in the Equal Status Act is gender, but in some of the others it's sex. So you have the conflation across numbers of different pieces of legislation. So the ask seems to be from most of the groups to ask for the addition of sex as a protected characteristic, as opposed to getting into competing as to what gender should be interpreted as, and saying that there should be sex and gender. So it will be interesting to see what the outcome of the review of that will be, or what the quality of the submissions will be like. But that's kind of what's happening on the Irish front.